Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a mission, really, that spans billions of years.
It's a big one.
Yeah, tracing one of the most fundamental transformations in life's history. We're following that epic leap from simple, ancient anaerobic life all the way to the complex eukaryotic cells we see today. We've gone through sources focusing strictly on the evolutionary evidence here.
It really is the ultimate story of biological revolution. And our sources give us a pretty tight timeline to track it. We're starting way back, more than 3.5 billion years ago, with those first simple prokaryotic cells.
And they were dominant for so long.
Oh, absolutely. 2 full billion years before the first eukaryotic cells show up, around 1.8 billion years ago. Then that complexity sets the stage for multicellularity, which really takes off much later, maybe 750 million years ago.
That gap, 2 billion years between prokaryotes and eukaryotes,
Right.
it just highlights how massive that jump in complexity really was. Prokaryotes are, elegant in their own way, but eukaryotes are this huge upgrade.
Definitely an upgrade.
We're talking cells that are generally aerobic, they've got complex internal membranes, organelles, a cytoskeleton, even sophisticated division like mitosis, features totally missing before.
And it's interesting how we categorize life now. We often say prokaryotes and eukaryotes, but it's actually 3 domains: Eubacteria, Archaea, and Eukarya.
Right.
And genomic sequencing shows that Archaea, well, they share several core genetic similarities with us, with Eukarya. It suggests the root of the tree is maybe more tangled than we first thought, not just a simple split.
Okay, let's unpack that upgrade then, starting with the big thing, internal compartments. Organelles.
Yeah.
They're everywhere in eukaryotic cells.
Everywhere.
You've got the nucleus holding the DNA, the ER doing protein synthesis, Golgi bodies for secretion, and the powerhouses, mitochondria for respiration.
And chloroplasts for photosynthesis in plants and algae.
Exactly.
And the key advantage of all these membranes, fundamentally, is isolation. Think of it like a super efficient factory. You need specialized reaction sequences kept separate. So transcription happens in the nucleus, translation out in the cytoplasm, and aerobic metabolism is confined to the mitochondria. This separation allows for chemical specialization, complexity that prokaryotes just couldn't manage without those internal membranes.
That separation seems crucial for complexity, for high energy use. But like always in evolution, there's a twist, isn't there? Because most are aerobic, but not all.
Not all, no. That's the fascinating part. While most eukaryotes thrive on oxygen, you find some single-celled ones, like Giardia or Trichomonas, that use totally anaerobic energy pathways.
But they came from aerobic ancestors.
The evidence points that way, yes. It looks like they evolved from aerobic ancestors. It's sort of a functional retreat, adapting back to low-oxygen environments.
That's amazing. They climbed the complexity ladder and then stepped back down, metabolically speaking. We even see that kind of adaptability now, right? The sources mention yeast.
Ah, yes, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Great example. Sometimes mutations pop up in a gene called Flo11, and this mutation allows some yeast cells to suddenly float.
Float.
Yeah, float up to the surface of whatever liquid they're in. This gives them access to the oxygen-rich layer. It's a simple genetic change, but it shows how quickly organisms can adapt between aerobic and anaerobic conditions based on, well, genetic opportunity.
Okay, so that metabolic flexibility, the jump to using oxygen efficiently with mitochondria and chloroplasts, that brings us right to how they got those organelles, doesn't it? The endosymbiotic theory.
Exactly. This is really the most well-supported hypothesis for where these organelles came from. The idea is that ancestral anaerobic eukaryotic cells developed the ability to engulf, to eat, basically.
Per cells.
Eat whole prokaryotic organisms, yeah, through endocytosis. And some of these engulfed prokaryotes weren't digested. Instead, they stuck around and formed a permanent, mutually beneficial partnership. They became the organelles.
So early complex life literally ate its way to complexity.
That's one way to put it. And this ties back to another key eukaryotic feature, that internal cytoskeleton we mentioned. Actin filaments, microtubules. These gave the early eukaryotes shape, movement, and crucially, the ability to be active predators, to engulf things.
Like aerobic bacteria.
Which became mitochondria.
And photosynthetic cyanobacteria.
Which became chloroplasts. This initial engulfment, that's primary symbiosis.
And the evidence for this engulfment story is strong.
Oh, it's overwhelming. There are several key lines. First, these organelles, mitochondria, and chloroplasts, they have their own DNA, separate from the main nuclear DNA.
mtDNA and chloroplast DNA, right?
Right. And it's usually inherited uniparentally, meaning you typically only get it from one parent, usually the mother, via the egg cell.
Okay, that's distinct. What else?
Second, look at the ribosomes inside these organelles, the machinery that builds proteins. Biochemically, size-wise, sequence-wise, they're much more similar to prokaryotic ribosomes than they are to the ribosomes in the host cell's cytoplasm.
Huh. Like little bacterial factories still running inside?
Pretty much. And third, we've found specific genetic links. It's hypothesized that the aerobic ancestor of our mitochondria was something similar to a modern bacterium called Rickettsia prowazekii.
The typhus parasite.
That's the one, an obligate intracellular parasite.
Wow. So the ancestor was already used to living inside other cells.
Exactly. That finding is critical.
Yeah.
It suggests the eventual engine of complex aerobic life might have come from an organism already adapted, in a sense, to invading and surviving within a host cell.
And that mitochondrial DNA, the mtDNA, it's interesting stuff. In us, it's this tiny circular molecule, right? Way smaller than the nuclear genome.
Tiny, yes. Human mtDNA is about 16,569 base pairs. Very compact.
And because it's inherited from one parent and doesn't seem to have great repair mechanisms.
Exactly. Mutations accumulate much faster in mtDNA than in nuclear DNA. It doesn't undergo recombination like nuclear DNA does, so it acts like a faster-ticking evolutionary clock. Really useful for tracking more recent evolutionary history.
Okay, so that's primary symbiosis, but the story gets even more complex.
It does. Engulfment didn't stop there. We also see secondary endosymbiosis. This is where a eukaryotic cell engulfs another eukaryotic cell that already contains chloroplasts.
Like Russian nesting dolls of cells?
Precisely. It's happened multiple times in different lineages. And even more dramatically, we've seen something called chloroplast capture happen in real time. Well, sort of. In experiments with grafted tobacco plants, chloroplasts from one species can actually travel across the graft junction and replace the chloroplasts in the cells of the other species.
Whoa, so the host cell isn't just eating the guest, it's stealing its photosynthetic machinery.
Effectively, yes. And over evolutionary time, that theft became permanent. Many of the original genes from the engulfed bacteria, whether for mitochondria or chloroplasts, have actually migrated.
Migrated where?
To the host cell's nucleus. So now, the nucleus contains the genes that code for many organelle proteins.
But the proteins are needed inside the organelle.
Right, so the cell has to make the protein in the cytoplasm and then use special signal and transit peptide tags to specifically target and transport that protein back into the correct organelle where it functions.
Yeah.
The host cell really took complete control genetically and metabolically.
That's incredible integration. Now, speaking of genetic control and complexity,
Yeah.
what about the nucleus itself? Its origin seems just as pivotal, maybe even more so, than the organelles.
They're deeply intertwined. Because the eukaryotic nuclear genome, it's what we call chimeric.
Chimeric, like a mix.
Exactly, mosaic.
Ah.
It contains a huge patchwork of genes. Many are similar to genes found in Eubacteria, but there are also large numbers very similar to genes found in Archaea. This strongly suggests some kind of ancient fusion event at the very foundation of the eukaryotic lineage.
A fusion. So what's the leading idea there?
Well, one prominent hypothesis involves a fusion between an Archaebacterium and a gram-negative Eubacterium. In this model, the Archaea partner might have provided the core information processing machinery, while the bacterium contributed metabolic genes.
Huh.
Perhaps it was the ancestor of something like the hydrogenosome.
Ah, the hydrogenosome. That connects back to those anaerobic eukaryotes, like Giardia we talked about earlier. They have this modified anaerobic remnant of a mitochondrion.
Exactly. It's like an evolutionary echo. The genome's composition literally reflects this mixed ancestry.
Okay, so we have organelles from bacteria, a nucleus with mixed ancestry, and then there's another massive genetic feature unique to eukaryotes: split genes.
Yes, this is huge. Almost entirely absent in prokaryotes. We're talking about genes where the actual coding sequence is the exons.
The bits that code for protein.
Right. Those bits are interrupted by stretches of non-coding DNA called introns. These introns can be really long, sometimes much longer than the exons themselves.
So how does the cell deal with that? You can't just translate the whole thing, introns and all.
No, you can't. There's a whole processing step. First, the entire gene, introns and exons, is transcribed into a long strand of pre-mRNA. Then, this incredibly complex molecular machine in the nucleus, called the stellicosome, gets to work.
The spliceosome.
Yeah, it recognizes the boundaries between introns and exons, precisely cuts out the introns, and then splices the exons together to create the final, mature messenger RNA that gets translated into protein.
That sounds intricate and prone to errors.
It is incredibly precise, actually. But the complexity isn't just a burden. it's also an opportunity. This splicing mechanism allows for alternate splicing,
Alternate splicing, meaning?
meaning the cell can choose which exons to include in the final mRNA. From a single gene, by splicing the exons together in different combinations, the cell can create many different versions of a protein, or proteins with related but distinct functions. It's a massive source of diversity.
Wow, so one gene doesn't just equal one protein anymore. It's like a recipe book with optional ingredients.
That's a great analogy. It generates huge functional diversity from a relatively smaller number of genes compared to if every protein needed its own separate, uninterrupted gene.
So where did these introns come from? Was the common ancestor full of them and prokaryotes just lost them to be more streamlined? Or did they appear later in eukaryotes?
The introns early versus introns late debate. It's been argued both ways for a long time. The current evidence is a bit messy, honestly. It suggests maybe multiple origins for different types of introns. You have the spliceosomal introns we just discussed, but also self-splicing introns in some organelles and bacteria, groups 1 through 3.
So not a simple answer.
Not really. But regardless of their precise origin, introns might have played crucial roles early on, perhaps in regulating gene expression or facilitating the shuffling of protein domains through exon recombination. They likely helped enable the evolution of more complex gene networks needed for eukaryotes.
Okay, so internal complexity, genetic complexity with introns. But evolution isn't just about what happens within a lineage, is it? What about genes moving between species? Horizontal gene transfer, or HGT.
Right, HGT, sometimes called lateral gene transfer. This is a huge factor, especially when we look at prokaryotes. It's the movement of DNA across species boundaries, completely different from the usual vertical inheritance from parent to offspring.
And it's common in prokaryotes.
Extremely common. Some estimates suggest that in certain bacterial lineages, up to 90% of their genome might have been acquired horizontally at some point.
90%? How does that even happen?
Mostly through viruses, which can accidentally pick up host DNA and transfer it to the next cell they infect, or through small circular DNA molecules called plasmids that can be readily exchanged between bacteria, even distantly related ones.
So bacteria are constantly swapping genes.
Pretty much. The data is striking. One study on E. coli, for instance, estimated that since it diverged from its relatives about 100 million years ago, it's experienced over 200 major HGT events. They figured maybe 20% of the modern E. coli genome came from these horizontal transfers.
That's a lot. Does this happen in eukaryotes too?
It does, although generally thought to be less frequent or less pervasive than in prokaryotes. But we definitely see it. Think about the rapid spread of antibiotic resistance genes among bacteria that's often HGT. We also see mobile genetic elements, transposons or jumping genes, moving between species. Over a third of the frog Xenopus tropicalis genome seems to be made of these elements, some likely acquired horizontally.
Okay, transposons, resistance genes. Any really dramatic examples?
Oh yeah. One of the most stunning cases mentioned in our sources is the fruit fly Drosophila ananassa. It appears to have acquired the entire genome of a bacterial parasite called Wolbachia via HGT.
It's the whole genome.
Just integrated.
Integrated into one of the fly's chromosomes. A whole bacterial genome, just downloaded into the fly's genetic library. That completely scrambles the idea of a neat family tree, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. This is the monumental implication for phylogeny, for understanding evolutionary relationships. HGT really obscures relationships based purely on shared ancestry. If two unrelated organisms both get the same gene horizontally, they might look more closely related than they are.
Especially for bacteria.
Especially for prokaryotes, yes. Genes for really core functions like ribosomal RNA or basic cell wall components seem less likely to transfer successfully. But genes for specialized functions like metabolism or resistance move around readily. This has led many researchers to argue that trying to draw a single, clean, universal tree of life, especially for prokaryotes, is misleading. It might be better represented as a reticulate web or network showing all that cross-transfer.
A web of life, not just a tree. Okay, so we've gone from simple cells through symbiosis and genetic complexity, complicated by HGT. Let's move to the final big leap in our timeline, multicellularity. The emergence of complex multicellular eukaryotes around 750 million years ago.
Right. This sets the stage for the explosion of animal and plant life, like the forms we see emerge dramatically in the Cambrian period, around 545 million years ago.
Why did cells start sticking together and cooperating like that? What were the advantages?
There are several key selective advantages. First, simply getting bigger. It helps avoid being eaten and overcome surface area to volume limits that constrain single cells. Second, specialization.
division of labor.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Different cells can take on distinct jobs: reproduction, protection, feeding, movement. Much more efficient than one cell trying to do everything. And third, it can enhance the dispersal of offspring or larval stages.
Now, we should probably clarify something here. When we say multicellularity, we mean something specific, right? It's not just cells clumping together.
That's crucial distinction. True multicellularity, like we see in animals, plants, or algae like Volvox, involves cells originating from a single progenitor, like a zygote, staying together after division, communicating, and specializing to form a single integrated organism.
Okay, and that's different from...
Different from pluricellularity. That's more like an aggregation or colony of individual cells that might cooperate temporarily, but don't necessarily have that same level of integration or specialization derived from a single lineage. Think of slime mold aggregations or maybe coral colonies, though corals are complex. The key is that true multicellular organisms function as a cohesive whole with specialized parts.
Got it. So how did this true multicellularity evolve? Did it require inventing tons of new genes?
That's where some fascinating genomic comparisons come in. Researchers compared the complex multicellular green alga Volvox carteri. It has specialized reproductive and somatic cells with its close relative, the single-celled alga Chlamydomonas reinhardti.
Okay, complex versus simple, but related.
Exactly. And what they found was surprising. Despite the huge difference in complexity and lifestyle, the total number of genes in both organisms was remarkably similar, around 14,500 genes each.
So becoming multicellular wasn't about adding lots of new genes.
Apparently not, or at least not primarily. The implication is that the origin of multicellularity was less about inventing brand new building blocks, genes, and more about changing how existing genes were used. It involved evolving new ways to regulate when and where genes are turned on and off, creating complex gene regulatory networks and cascades that lead to cell differentiation and specialization.
So complexity comes from control, not just from having more parts lists.
Precisely. It's about the sophisticated orchestration of the genome.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize all this. Billions of years, prokaryotes to eukaryotes, symbiosis, introns, HGT, multicellularity. What's the big picture here from this deep dive?
I think the big picture is that eukaryotic evolution is defined by layers of increasing complexity, built piece by piece. It started with symbiotic acquisition, basically incorporating other life forms. Then came internal genomic innovation like introns and alternate splicing, allowing for more regulatory control. And all along, especially earlier on, there was this influx of genetic material via horizontal transfer, muddying the waters. The complexity we see today is really built on these ancient foundations of cooperation, theft, and innovation.
So the key takeaway for you listening is that this incredible transition from simple prokaryotes to complex eukaryotes wasn't one single event. It was driven by acquiring internal membranes through symbiosis and then leveraging new genetic flexibility, split genes, regulation to create metabolic cooperation and specialization within a single compartmentalized cell.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thought to leave you with, connecting back to HGT. If horizontal gene transfer is so rampant in prokaryotes, that it forces us to think of their evolution more like a reticulate web than a simple tree. How does that impact our view of the universal tree of life overall? Is the tree concept still a useful starting point for understanding all life? Or is it maybe fundamentally misleading for the vast majority of life's history on Earth, which was dominated by these web-like prokaryotic exchanges?
That's a really interesting question to ponder. Does the tree metaphor hold up? Food for thought. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the origins of cellular complexity. We'll catch you next time.